Welcome to the final lecture of the Dwight Terry Lecture Series this fall, given by the distinguished historian of science, Professor Janet Browne, titled Becoming Darwin, History, Memory, and Biography. Since this is the final lecture, before we proceed, I just wanted to give a word of thanks to Heather Calabrese and her team members who've been working behind the scenes to make this a great success. And also I want to thank the Office of the Secretary at Yale University for providing the support for this amazing series. So let's thank all the people working behind the scenes even before we start. Thanks, Heather. We've had the pleasure and delight of hearing in the previous two lectures about very interesting facets of Darwin's life and his character from Professor Browne. First, we learned of his impeccable record-keeping that extended into his personal life as well as in his scientific work. In the second lecture, we heard about accounts, including his own, of his scientific life. And today, we will be hearing more about the iconography and the imagery, the construction of the image of Darwin, as well as, not unrelated, the establishment of him as a scientific icon. Iconic scientists and what really makes one, whether it is the radicalness of their ideas, the impact of their ideas, or their broader engagement in the public sphere, are all very, very interesting questions. But they're completely intertwined with the construction of the image, the persona of the scientist after their life. The BBC did a poll a few years ago to rank scientific icons in the world. And as you can probably imagine, the three names that filtered up were Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. Darwin's ideas on evolution, as we have heard from Janet, shook the world in an incredibly unique way as they contested a pre-existing account for the origin of life, one that wielded enormous authority. So in terms of the transformative nature of his ideas, Darwin clearly has had the roughest ride of the three icons that I mentioned. But in terms of the iconography and the image of Darwin, I'm very curious to hear about Darwin's sage look versus Einstein's unkempt hair. At any rate, I'm sure, like me, you're waiting eagerly to hear from Professor Browne about the construction of Darwin's image and the iconography. Without further ado, I would like to invite Janet to give the final Terry lecture of this series.
Thank you very much, both for that generous welcome and for all turning out on this rainy afternoon, which is also a holiday, so I do appreciate it. Thank you for being here. And I do want to reiterate and say again how very kind and efficient and thoughtful the Terry Committee have been, and I would like to say once again, thank you for the invitation. I've been thrilled to bits to accept, so I'm very glad to be here. And today, as already suggested, I'm going to be reflecting on some of the portraits and the public commemorations of Charles Darwin, and what this might have signified for the distribution and the assimilation of his ideas of the great laws of nature as requested by the terms of the Terry Lectureship. I'm actually going to talk about these three pictures here. It seems to me that many of the commemorative endeavors of the past 150 years, as they related to Darwin, can be regarded as ways of grappling with the question of how to assimilate his ideas and how to present his very controversial achievements to the general public. especially at times like today, when large numbers of individuals may not believe in evolution of any kind. So the controversy that originally surrounded evolutionary ideas has never really gone away, even 150 years later. And my plan this evening is to look at some of the portraits and the mass media images of Darwin that were produced in the English-speaking world, as well as the foundation of a museum in his home in England, before turning to consider some of the ways we encounter Darwinism in America today. The stories necessarily linked to the ebb and flow of the acceptance of Darwinism. And as you can imagine, many portraits were made of Darwin during his lifetime in different media, including pastels, watercolors, oils, lithography, engravings, caricatures, which we mustn't forget, and early photography. The earliest images were made for family eyes alone, of which this is the most charming pastel drawing of Darwin aged 7 and his younger sister Catherine. It's one of a set of the Darwin children made in 1816, and their mother, Susanna Darwin, died the year after this was drawn. Perhaps a more well-known one is the one which we've seen already quite a number of times, and you've seen endlessly, which is actually part of my talk today. This is the most well-known picture of Darwin as a young man, sometimes referred to as the Beagle Portrait, which is just by chance, it was the only other known picture, apart from the picture of Darwin as a 7-year-old. It's the only other painting of him taken around the time of the Beagle Voyage. This was actually done 4 years after the Beagle returned back to Great Britain. It's one of a pair that we saw on Tuesday last week, made around 1840 to mark his marriage in 1839 to his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And the pair of portraits was requested by Emma Darwin's sister, Elizabeth, to hang in the family Wedgwood home in Staffordshire. It was never really hung in Darwin's home. It was for relatives to look at. And the point here is that some portraiture is for domestic consumption. And as Walter Benjamin insisted, the uniqueness of a work of art controls its history. If something's unique, it has a particular kind of history. If something is mechanically reproduced and spread, it has another kind of history. And as the Beagle Voyage became increasingly significant in the public imagination, some of the books I spoke about on Thursday, the Beagle Voyage was a very important element of the way that Darwin's life was told. As the voyage became more significant, so this portrait was increasingly made public. It was a private portrait, remember, but it then became public through reproduction. As the technologies diversified and improved, it was reproduced in books, first in black and white, then in color, in slideshows at public lectures, starting from 1909 onwards, TV documentaries, especially those relating to the Galapagos archipelago, museum displays, and elsewhere. So with continued replication, it's become what we might even call democratized. And it's available in modern memories in ways that would be impossible for the original for the originals originally concerned. So this image and others of Darwin have become emancipated from their origins. They've been given fresh meanings, and they've been placed in situations where it would be impossible for the single, unique original to go. I'll just show you a couple of places here. This is a tattoo on the left. I don't know, maybe you can guess what part of the anatomy this is. Is it someone's shoulder blade? And then it's been photographed with a mask around it. I'm not entirely sure. But it's a tattoo. Somebody has had Darwin's beagle face tattooed on their body. More often it's the, I think, evolutionary tree on somebody's shoulder, but this is very unusual. And then endless mugs, T-shirts, and various ways of reproducing Darwin's face for those people who wish to have him in their daily life. And I thank one of the Yale graduate students for directing me to Darwin's Twitter site. Now, I took this off last week, so it's probably out of date now, but you can see there's quite a lot of people asking Darwin questions, and he responds. Yeah, I have to say, if luck is only one little earthquake having happened, I felt my bed slightly vibrate in a lateral direction. So he's responding, and I don't know who it is. It is somebody, obviously. And there's a similar private portrait, a photograph this time, that became public during Darwin's lifetime, that was Julia Margaret Cameron's photograph of Darwin taken in 1868 when he was on a family holiday on the Isle of Wight, which is to the south of Britain, where she lived. And Julia Margaret Cameron's purpose in the left-hand one, that's an original, so to speak. The others are mechanically reproduced. The purpose was to photograph a number of intellectuals and creative minds and to show their intellectuality, the power of their minds through the kind of peaceful repose of the photograph. She took Tennyson, Alfred Tennyson, she took the astronomer John Herschel, she took Robert Browning, and she took some other eminent men. Her photographs of women were completely different, very strong gendering in her imagery. The women were all dressed up as maids of Shalott and other kinds of historic scenes that she was keen to replicate. Darwin was very pleased with this portrait, and he provided an endorsement in his own handwriting that can sometimes be seen underneath the picture, which is here, and it's a poor reproduction. I do apologize. And it's from a letter that he wrote to Cameron, and she got it lithographed and then applied to the prints. I like this photograph very much better than any other which has been taken of me, and then it's signed Darwin, Charles Darwin. So Cameron sold these photographs. The intention was to sell them in limited numbers, blind stamps on them, at Colnagi's Gallery in Bond Street in London. And this is one of those here. So she's had his signature reproduced and then made under copyright Julia Margaret Cameron. Provided her family with quite an income. It's an evocative portrait. There were 3 or 4 sittings, or at least 3 or 4 exposures taken during the one sitting, and it appears on the English £10 note here on the right. That will be taken out of circulation fairly shortly. So you should get one if you want your Darwin on a £10 note. Really, he's going to be shunted off next year, and we don't know who's going on yet, or at least I don't know. So the Cameron has been reproduced many times, and the oddest place that I've come across it is in the ticket hall of a provincial railway station in Great Britain, Brockenhurst in Hampshire, England. So he gets everywhere, and it's rather astonishing to think why a railway station might have hung an image of Darwin on their walls. There were 2 other photographs of Darwin that became an integral part of the story and the visual legacy. This is one of them. On the left here, it was taken by Darwin's son, Leonard, who was a very enthusiastic home photographer with all the early equipment. And it's Darwin seated on the tessellated floor, the veranda of the house in Kent, where he lived for decades and decades. It was reproduced very many times, copiously, we might even say, as a woodcut and a steel engraving here, and formed the frontispiece to several of the biographies that came out relating to Darwin that I discussed the other day. There's another one that you'll also recognize. It's a slightly different exposure here. Here is Darwin taken at the very end of his life, although he didn't know it was the end of his life. Again on the veranda at Down House, wearing this cape that becomes quite an important visual signifier of his occupations and age, and also his status as an independent, privately financed gentleman. And then that was slightly different. You can see his head is more turned, was engraved and again turned up as frontispieces in many different kinds of published works. So the boundary between private and public was already blurred before Darwin even deceased. He was a celebrity by the time he died. So most of the other portraits of Darwin and the statues that I'll turn to in a moment were deliberately produced for public display. As evolutionary ideas became more widely disseminated during his lifetime, he became one of the first scientific celebrities, and his image could be found in an increasingly wide variety of places and in different media. And the one I particularly want to address, because of its prominence in our minds today, is this very exceptional portrait, oil portrait, painted by the artist John Kaalia in 1881, from life, and subsequently multiplied many, many times and in many media. It was painted by subscription at the request of the Linnean Society of London, whose members raised a fund to commission Kaalia. Kaalia was Thomas Henry Huxley's son-in-law. He had married Huxley's daughter, Marion, and was a member of the pre-Raphaelite set in central London. Kaalia and his wife Marion, because they had social relations with Darwin, came to stay in Darwin's house whilst the sketches were being made for this portrait. Marion was an excellent artist herself, and she made a pencil sketch of Darwin during that visit that I think is very evocative. It's really unusual to see something so relaxed in the Darwin portraiture. Now, the Linnean Society had many reasons to consider Darwin as their most prominent member. On July 1858, you'll recall, the Linnean Society was the place in which the double contribution from Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace was read to the members. It first proposed evolution by natural selection in the meeting room of the Linnean Society. And Darwin remained a very active contributor to the Linnean Society until his death. So by hanging Darwin on their walls, the Society was making several claims for scientific attention, not least to bolster the important role of natural history in an increasingly experimental biological science. So the portrait, which I'm just going to go back to here, Darwin's portrait on the left, was saying things to members in the meeting room of the Linnean Society, that here we have our most famous member. And I wanted to just mention, before I talk about the Huxley portrait, the social network that lay behind Kaalia's portrait of Darwin was really extensive. The president of the Linnean Society was John Lubbock, who was Darwin's close friend and neighbour in Kent. The Society's secretary, who had raised the subscription money, was Darwin's favourite disciple, George Romanes. and presumably Collier's relationship with Huxley was a strong factor in the allocation of the commission. So it's worth noting that there was in 1881, when this portrait was painted, there was no comparable groundswell of opinion to financially support a portrait of Alfred Russel Wallace. The omission was only rectified in 1998 with a large portrait of Wallace by Roger Remington that now hangs next to the Kaalia in the Linnaean Society meeting rooms. So Wallace was kind of not written out of the story, but he was overlooked until 1998 when a commissioned portrait was made of him. So this Darwin portrait was copied 3 times, twice by Kaalia, in the next 30 years for other institutions, including the Royal Society, which had forgotten to commission a portrait of Darwin during his lifetime. So Collier's taste for the theatrical is plainly demonstrated here. Darwin's shown full face, a magnificent beard, which for many people then and now still has resonances of a saintly frame of mind. It's patriarchal, it could even be godly in its magnificence. It's a beard that we do need to recognize is playing a role in the picture. And his clothes are just an impression of a cloak and a hat. I'm afraid this is a reproduction of the Royal Society copy rather than the one in the National Portrait Gallery, which is a bit redder around the back. So you can't see, but there is a cloak and he's holding a hat here in his hand. He's clearly ready to go out for a walk, and that actually was Collier's intention, to show him away from his desk, away from the mental work that usually went into scientific creation. But here he is, a private individual, a gentleman, on his way out for a walk in the natural world, but nevertheless he's one who saw further into nature than his contemporaries. So we have Darwin, who's really very magisterial and mysterious in this, and Huxley, which, dear, I'm sorry, you perhaps can see that better from afar than I can. Huxley's leaning rather insolently up against a table with some books underneath his arm, and he's dangling this human skull and is ready for a fight. So the way that they're represented is different. They're both intellectuals, they're both scientists, they're both no background behind them. The intention is for you to understand that these were thinking people, but they're thinking slightly different things. And in Darwin's, I would just draw your attention to the way that the eyes have become the focus of the portrait, which isn't unusual for portraiture, but nevertheless, one of Darwin's doctors went on record saying that Darwin was all eyes. He was always watching, always observing. And I think that this Kaalia portrait has a lot to, or did have a lot to say to its first audience, and that it has had things to say to us over the decades that are very powerful. So this was iconography that was designed to impress. And in similar fashion, there were several towns in Great Britain who had been associated with Darwin during his lifetime, who engaged in competition after his death to erect a statue. So here is the statue in Shrewsbury, which was Darwin's birthplace. The statue is rather a handsome seated bronze Darwin. It's life-size. It's taken from that photograph by Darwin's son, Leonard. And here is the opening ceremony with all the worthy Shrewsburyites milling around, happy to commemorate Darwin in their own town. There are other Darwin images, again taken from photographs. This is the Oxford University Natural History Museum, They commissioned a standing Darwin to match the other standing images that are sort of holding up the roof in the inner courtyard. It's rather loosely interpreted because there is no image of Darwin standing so casually with his feet crossed like that, or his hands crossed on his chest. It's imaginary. And this museum, unlike Shrewsbury, this museum was not where Darwin had been born. In fact, Darwin had not been there. It was the location of the clash in 1860 between Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce, at which Huxley is thought to have said, we don't know the exact words, but he's thought to have said that he'd rather have an ape for a grandfather than a bishop who twisted the truth like Wilberforce did. So the purpose of the statue in Oxford is very different from the purpose of the statue in Shrewsbury. It's highlighting the triumph of rational science. Over here in North America, American biologists had a slightly different agenda. They wished to show that they too were part of a big swing towards Darwinism. And the New York Academy of Sciences commissioned the artist William Cooper to produce a portrait bust, which is on the left here, in 1909, and it was displayed at the American Museum of Natural History at their 1909 Darwin celebrations in a new hall of invertebrate zoology that was named the Darwin Hall. It doesn't exist now, but it did then, named for Darwin. And a copy of it was sent to Cambridge in England for their 1909 celebrations, in which the deputation that accompanied the bust was very interested in stressing how American biologists were as deeply engaged in the modernizing thrust of biology as the Cambridge, England scientists expected they were. So it was to show that America too participated in this grand movement. And another copy, this one here, was erected on the Galapagos Islands in 1935 to commemorate 100 years after Darwin's visit there in 1835. And that's an action that has a different purpose again. In the 1930s, the early years of the World Wildlife Fund, actually the precursor of the World Wildlife Fund, was putting political pressure on Ecuador to turn the whole archipelago into a conservation zone. And Ecuador was quite rightly saying, but our fishery industry is based on those islands, and it will substantially undermine the Ecuadorian balance of payments. It was turned into a zone, and I rather think if I looked a little more into the papers, I'd find that America offered to help subsidize some of the consequences if the archipelago was turned into a conservation zone with no fishing. So these statues of various kinds were intended to some degree to appropriate Darwin as a famous son, to valorize participation in frontline biology, and to substantiate the internationalization of modern science. Darwinism itself, although not universally accepted, was hardly under religious pressure at this point. Othniel Marsh, who you will all know, the great biologist of Yale and founder of the Peabody Museum, was noted for his remarkable work under the guidance of Huxley, but the work was his own, on the fossil ancestry of the horse that shows from the earliest times the horse was an animal that had digits, just like most vertebrates, and that these evolved and adapted into a single, excessively enlarged one digit, which is the horse's hoof today. Marsh did this using the fossil record at a time when the fossil record was really not very obviously something that supported evolution or not evolution. The fossil record didn't have enough specimens to make a series like this that is very effective demonstration of the possibility of evolutionary processes. So Marsh was working here at Yale. It's on the first, and it's still one of the most striking examples of how evolution could have worked. Marsh wasn't troubled by religious controversy at any point. So just moving back to England, the Natural History Museum in London also staked a claim in the Darwin legend, the heritage industry of Darwin. And after Darwin's death, the museum raised a public subscription for a marble statue carved by Joseph Boehm. And I don't know how many of you have been to the London Natural History Museum, but those of you who have been will remember that it's designed very like a cathedral, a giant Romanesque Gothic cathedral with a kind of double staircase at one end and a gigantic stained glass window, and at the back behind you where you come in, what could be, if it had been a cathedral, what would have been an organ loft. It's a cathedral to nature, designed completely without any evolutionary ideas in mind. The interesting point that I'm going to bring out here was that this statue by Joseph Boehm was placed in the museum exactly where the altar would be if it was a cathedral. So, and here is the opening ceremony, 1885, with Huxley, still alive, still very, very vigorous, the same age as that portrait by Kaalia that we saw. Huxley unveiling it and making some remarks about the transformative effect of Darwin's theories. And here is the statue. You will see in just a moment the altarpiece, but I just want to show you this in between. In 1927, times had changed, and the new director was very conscious of the way genetics had come to the fore, and that Darwin's work represented something that was being superseded by the new genetically based evolutionary sciences. Darwin's ideas looked old-fashioned. They were accurate enough, but they were not based on genetics, as we know. And so here is Darwin being moved off the altar, down the steps in 1927, and he was moved to a spot under the stairs, which was open to the public, which was the cafe. And there he sat for many, many years. When I was a young woman going to the museum, there was Darwin under the stairs in the cafe with a marble Huxley next to him, also by the sculptor Joseph Boehm. And then again, times change. And back in 2008, just in time for the big Darwin celebrations all over Britain, Darwin was moved back from the cafe to this altarpiece. You see what I mean about it being just like a cathedral? And Darwin's in front of this green spot. You can just see him there, back where he originally was, in the place of honor for 2009, when his work was being celebrated. It's an interesting little history of changing values in biology. Now, there's often thought to be a very special resonance between a writer and their home or their place. And I think this is particularly justified in the case of Darwin and his home down house in Kent, in England. It's a very good example of the reification of a building or a landscape that becomes such an important part of the public engagement with science. At Down, Darwin and his family were a very integral part of the fabric of country life that characterized the landed classes in Britain during the middle years of the 19th century. And after Darwin's death, they kept the house, but Emma Darwin, his wife, moved to Cambridge, also in England, where 3 of her adult sons lived. They kept the house for several decades more, but they only visited in the summer months, and then eventually they sold it to a girls' school. Nice big house for a girls' private school. And the sons by then were married, they had families of their own, and they played a prominent role in Cambridge University life. And much of this is written about by Gwen Rather, one of Darwin's granddaughters, but also one of the 4 children of George Darwin and his American wife, Maud Dupuy, who came from Philadelphia. This is Gwen Rather, who became a noted artist as an adult, part of the Bloomsbury set. And she captured what was a very privileged and innocent childhood in Cambridge with much charm. She included anecdotes about her hypochondriac aunts and uncles and father, which you see here. Here is Henrietta Darwin, Darwin's daughter, Henrietta, Aunt Etty, completely hypochondriac in her later life, with a little mask over her nose so that she wouldn't catch any germs from the maid. It's her patent anti-cold mask. And here is Aunt Etty again, she's gardening here with Gwen as a child in at Down House. So Down House features quite a bit in Gwen Rather's memoir. But she actually lived in a house in Cambridge with George Darwin, her father, a very handsome house on the river that's now a university college named after the Darwin family. It's another form of commemoration that deserves mention. Now the house, just staying with the house for a moment, the house remained as a girls' school through the First World War, and then in 1927, Sir Arthur Keith, who we met briefly as one of Darwin's biographers last Thursday, Arthur Keith lived in a house very close to Darwin's original home and was a paleoanthropologist. Arthur Keith declared that this house needed to be secured for the nation. It ought to be turned into a museum of some kind. And there were a number of factors behind that plea. That year, 1927, scientists had celebrated the bicentenary of Newton's death, Isaac Newton's death, with a ceremony in Lincolnshire, plenty of self-congratulatory newsprint, and a reverential letter from Albert Einstein saying, "You Englishmen have carefully cultivated the bonds of tradition and preserved the living and conscious continuity of successive generations." Einstein was talking in relation to in relation to Newton, and Keith turned that around and applied it to Darwin, and saying that what was due to physics should also be due to biology, and that where Newtonians went, the Darwinians should follow. So there were many, many financial difficulties, and I won't go into those, except to say that there was a remarkably generous act offered by the very famous geneticist Thomas Hunt Morgan, who offered his Nobel Prize money to help purchase Darwin's home for the nation. And looking through the committee records, there was a, I think, rather unnecessary nationalistic expression of views at that point, where they said that American money ought not to be used to support a great British hero. Anyway, so Thomas Hunt Morgan kept his Nobel cash, and the house was eventually purchased by this gentleman, George Buxton Browne, an extremely wealthy surgeon in London, who gave it in trust to the nation, the house in trust to the nation. It was furnished with the help of Darwin's surviving children, and they recreated the old rooms as they remembered them. So it's as accurate as we might hope to get, but it is a recreation. And when the house was opened, which you see here in 1929, just a few years later, it was from the first regarded as a secular temple to the mind of Charles Darwin. as they were then perceived. The most important room in the house was Darwin's study that you see, and I'm afraid this is from the photo taken in the 1920s, so it's pretty dark. But you can see, well, perhaps you can see, but you may not know, that this is all we know about Darwin's study. So the modern museum is exactly like this, but it's not at all clear if they're recreating to a photograph that is itself a memory in the minds of Darwin's children. It's a lovely old room. I just draw your attention to the stuffed dog here, waiting for Darwin to go for his walk in the morning and the afternoon. So the drama of this study that sort of represents Darwin's mind is intensified by the presence of the chair. So this is the chair in which Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. There is a board. He didn't use a desk. He just used a writing board on his knees. This is a page of manuscript up here. An ugly old chair that was his favorite chair in which he wrote all his books and articles. So that's, if you're a biologist, that's quite powerful, seeing the chair in which Darwin wrote. There's also Darwin's thinking path in the grounds of this house that he wrote about in his autobiography. His daily life included several turns around this path, which was an oval shape, a circuit, that if he did enough turns, he could have walked a half a mile or a mile and a half, depending on what he thought was significant for his health. So he would walk here every day. And that, too, has a lot of memory for biologists. When they go to Down, they all want to walk on the thinking path. It's something very special to do. So here we have Darwin's study recreated in 1927, where he wrote or he received 14,000 letters, maybe 15,000 letters. He produced 16 books. He read reviews. He persuaded his visitors to accept his theory, or at least to give it a chance. He dissected barnacles in here, and he observed orchids. So it's here that private theories were transformed into public knowledge. It represents a center of production and administration as efficient as any university laboratory, or a library, or a factory, or a museum. So the house is something more than just a pleasant afternoon out. It's actually speaking to us of situated knowledge, what sociologists call situated knowledge. And these room sets are full of an absent presence, the same kind of absent presence that Henry James writes about in his psychological stories. It's very important in generating the view that Darwin's work was rooted in his home. He didn't go out to work. He didn't need to. He didn't have a lab to visit. He did it all at home. He didn't have technicians working with him. He had his own staff. He didn't need to go to a library. The books came to him through the mail, or he purchased them. His home was his laboratory in very significant ways, but it was also a domestic place, it was a comfortable place, and it was a non-threatening place. And this image was very pervasive. I want to show you an imaginary scene or two and tell you, to mention that there is a sad story waiting to be told in the work of the Russian biologist Viktor Evstafiev, who painted a number of imaginary scenes of Darwin at home to send to the Darwin Museum in 1955. 1955 was 2 years after Stalin's death, when mainstream science in Russia was emerging following the downfall of Trofim Lysenko, whose environmental, non-Darwinian genetics had been the predominant scientific motif for 3 decades previously. So Evstafiev paints these at the time that Russian biology was opening up again to Darwinism. It had been one of the places where Darwinism was very much accepted with modification, that had been submerged during Lysenko's time. So here is Estafiev imagining from Darwin's autobiography, which he had read in published form, one of those evenings when Emma Darwin played the piano for Darwin himself, and he rested on the settee next to her. He had no image of Darwin's home, so the actual picture is imaginary. Here he was imagining what it might have been like when the letter from Alfred Russel Wallace arrived, telling Darwin that Wallace had a theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin didn't know Wallace had that theory. Completely fictitious. The room set is not Darwin Study. Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker were certainly not there. But they were part of the story in getting those two private works forward to the Linnaean Society for publication. So it's a memory, or it's wishing to make a memory about this particular point of view. And the other thing that Estafiev did was that he painted a rather wonderful imaginary picture of Alfred Russel Wallace that is used quite a lot. You may have seen it. It's taken from Wallace's memoirs, published in 1913, and is scientifically accurate, but again, completely imaginary. So contrast these images. They're very separate from the world as we know it. Contrast these images of rural stability with the furore over the Scopes trial in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, that took place after a state law was passed in 1925, specifying that it was a misdemeanor, and then here's the words of the law, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animal. And the American Civil Liberties Union had been watching Tennessee for quite a while, and were well known, as you will know, for supporting civil liberties in different areas of thought. The ACLU offered to defend any Tennessee schoolteacher who was willing to challenge this new law. And it was John Scopes, a very young man, he was only 24, a biology teacher at the high school, who volunteered to be the accused. And he taught a class using this textbook, George William Hunter's Civic Biology, that has 4 pages about evolutionary theory in it. And our memories of this event are very much coloured by Inherit the Wind, the movie. But we do need to think of this situation, this case, as a show trial. It was a test case for the law, especially because of the participation of the well-known politician and biblical fundamentalist William Jennings Bryan, who volunteered to prosecute, and Clarence Darrow, the prominent criminal lawyer, defense lawyer, who volunteered to defend. All of a sudden, this small trial went big time. And our memories are deeply coloured by the movie, which is wonderful, Inherit the Wind, produced in the post-McCarthy era, and it has its own agenda of intellectual freedom to pursue. But it does bring the trial to life in a very vivid way. The real-life trial was accompanied by all kinds of demonstrations, a great deal of local anti-evolutionary feeling that you see here, the bookstore, Anti-Evolution League, the conflict hell, and the high school. Very emotive, one could legitimately say. And this wasn't just a metaphysical debate, this was full of real implications about human ancestry. The implications of ape ancestry were made very obvious, both to the people in Dayton and in the newspapers reporting on the case. Here we have an animal impersonator, I suppose we could say, visiting in order to be photographed at Dayton whilst the Scopes trial was going on. And here's just an image from one of the newspapers of the day. Not guilty, I hope. This is very obvious. This is science and religion meeting in an obvious way that is not at all obvious in the British tradition that I've shown you. And the Scopes trial brought into focus, back into focus, the old idea about a conflict between science and religion, that the two ways of thought were necessarily in conflict, especially where the origins of human beings were concerned. And this more or less is where we are today. But today, we have the additional factor of rising attention being paid to creation science. And I wanted to show you this image, which surely many of you have seen previously. This is a poll. It's an international poll of polls in which the same question was asked of individuals, presumably only a small statistical sample of individuals in all these countries on the left, which is not every country in the world, but they're mainly countries in which evolutionary ideas are prevalent. And the response rate was tabulated and put together into this table for publication in 2006, beg your pardon. And the people who were being polled were responding to the question, have human beings, as we know them, developed from earlier species of animals? And as you will see, many of the people up at the top here thought that that was true. Yes, humans have descended from an earlier species of animal. There's a very consistent band of people who don't know or don't wish to respond to that question. And a bunch of people in all these different countries who believed that humans had not developed from earlier species of animal. And I want to draw your attention to the United States, down here, which bothers me. I show this every year in class, and it bothers students as well. We're next to Turkey, and you think, what is it that's happening here in North America that this kind of a response can be so obvious? 1 in 3 believes in the United States believes that evolution is false. 1 in 3 believes in evolution. You can see this, it's quite clear down here. And just about 1 in 3 doesn't know. So, isn't this disturbing in such an advanced society? And I wanted to dwell for a moment, before we close, on the current creationist movement, which partly must lie behind these kinds of responses. So the current creationist movement, I think, is rather different from the religious belief systems that were commonplace in the 19th century when Darwin was publishing. Modern creationist theory was pioneered in the 1970s by Henry Morris, who founded the Creation Research Society and the Institute for Creation Research in California. And this movement advocates for the literal truth of the Bible. It opposes evolution, and sometimes it opposes cosmologies as well, and it rejects any great age for the earth. And Morris coined the expression creation science, which is a little bit different from creationism. Creationism, you could imagine that people could believe in all kinds of different origins for the whole system that we exist in. Creation science has a very specific meaning in that the people who advocate this are using science. They are attempting to show that the so-called science of the universities can be explained by a different form of science that is different, that is creation science. So Morris coined this term, and he built his institute into a very wide-ranging organization, drawing on the various forms of evangelical revivalism, mostly located in the geographical south, but not always. And since then, creation science organizations have developed very highly efficient business models. They're based on an abundant cash flow, excellent media usage, especially the web, and well-placed political pressure, both localized, as in the school boards that have brought court cases against the teaching of evolution in schools, and in the wider sense in national political affairs. Pew research last year, for example, showed that 70% of Republicans would be less likely to vote for an atheist in comparison with 42% of Democrats. So those figures have not yet been applied to whether individuals believe in creation science or not, and as you can imagine, our current political candidates, our presidential candidates, are very reluctant to go out on a limb and say exactly what they believe, because they're going to be caught out on that. And the creation scientists move very extensively in the world of popular culture. They adopt the motifs of conventional science, such as TV shows, movies, books and magazines, websites, and more recently, museums and theme parks. And one of the biggest museums is the one run by Ken Ham, the Creation Museum in Kentucky, opened in 2007 at a cost of $27 million, including animatronic dinosaurs. It's a fabulous museum and theme park. So if you have grandchildren or children to take there or yourselves, it's very engaging. You can have a dinosaur ride. You can look at Adam and Eve and the creation. You can walk through an ark. It's incredibly persuasive for a very large sector of our society. And the rise of creationism, here's just another thing about Ken Ham. His website is called Answers in Genesis, so that you can email in and have an answer to your question, sometimes of considerable biological complexity, explained to you. So the rise of creationism has tended in the last several decades to promote an either-or frame of mind. Either it's the Bible or it's evolution, with very little possibility of harmonization. And I think that's a very, it can't be a beneficial dichotomy to think in this way. Here is the biologists are just as emphatic as the creation scientists, and it really can't be good to have a number of scientists so aggressively asserting that Darwinism is linked with atheism. So I don't have any answers to provide. I wanted to bring it to your attention. I would like to bring us back to the point where I began last week, where I began the Terry Lectures by emphasizing that we today still grapple with the questions that Darwin's writing opened up 150 years ago. I've tried in these lectures to step aside somewhat from the actual science that was being proposed and accepted or criticized, to ask more general questions about the assimilation of Darwin's ideas in popular culture. And I've taken as a starting point the belief that the material grounds of lived experience provide avenues of historical access that go beyond the texts into culture and the social assumptions of a range of communities and audiences. So I've touched upon Darwin's account books, his biographies, the portraits today, other visual representations, the commemorations, and popular souvenirs and ephemera, something like these, for example. We all recognize this kind of movement from chimp to mankind, this one with a humorous twist. Darwin's face that we've already seen is taken in many, many different media. This is a T-shirt, Chuck D. And then, of course, he's used and photoshopped in different ways for all kinds of posters. He's become part of our culture in a rather interesting way, and that's where I've been engaged in these 3 lectures. He's a figure enshrined in statuary, in buildings, and in artworks. He's been venerated and utilized, which restores, I think, an extra dimension to the histories of Darwinism. So the changing imagery, the consumer objects, the needs of his shifting audiences help us to understand a little more widely his remarkable scientific theory and the way that it's been assimilated into different cultures. And it helps us understand a little more of the processes of making and circulating scientific knowledge in all the complexities of the historical moment. I've hoped in these talks to show that we're still deeply engaged in the integration and understanding of evolutionary ideas, as Dwight Harrington Terry so perceptively realized might be the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janet, for a riveting set of lectures, for teaching us so much, and for getting us to think about many very interesting and complicated questions. So on behalf of the audience, the faithful audience, for all 3 lectures, I would like to give you another round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we now open the floor to questions, and there are microphones on either side. So please feel free to walk up and ask.
Very quick question. When and why did Darwin grow his beard? When and why did Darwin grow his beard?
1862. And
Great.
he had eczema. And he was feeling very unwell in the 1860s and decided, shaving with an old cutthroat razor, that it was aggravating his eczema, so he would try just growing a nice little beard. And the first pictures of him with a beard were taken by Leonard, his son. And it's a very handsome little beard, it's just a little beard. So there's something that must happen in the 1870s or the late 1860s where he just decides to let it hang out, that it's going to grow. And so, yes, it becomes, it's right down here by the time he had those last portraits taken. It's a magnificent beard. Thank you for the question. I actually think it's a really important beard, that it conveys to us, if we're just going to do some visual kind of sociology, it does convey a saintliness, a patriarchal oversight of the natural world, of sort of beneficence that I think contributes to our understanding of Darwin as a good man. I don't know that anybody thinks Darwin wasn't a good man, and I think the image of him supports that in an interesting way. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now let's hear it for the beardies.
Janet, would you like to say anything about who Darwin was replaced by in the Natural History Museum when he was consigned to the understairs?
Now, here's a man who knows his history. So the museum, the Natural History Museum in central London that Peter's referring to, was built to the specifications of a very well-known comparative anatomist called Richard Owen, who was extremely famous in his own day that has kind of got a bit submerged since the Darwinian themes have come to dominate. Richard Owen was not an evolutionist in any way. He believed in God's plan for nature to be expressed in comparative anatomy, that the parallels you could see between organisms was God's plan for nature. And he came to grips with Huxley very prominently after The Origin of Species was published, and Huxley and Owen fought at every possible opportunity and enjoyed fighting, the one for non-evolutionary ideas and Huxley for all kinds of evolutionary ideas associated with freedom of speech and political radicalism and casting God out of science. So what Peter is asking is, who replaced Darwin on the steps of the Natural History Museum? Well, it was the Richard Owen statue went back to the Natural History Museum in 1927. When Darwin was taken down the stairs to go into the cafe, the Owen statue, which is a very handsome bronze statue, went back there, as it was his museum. It was his museum. And then he was moved temporarily for Darwin to go back for 2009, and now Owen is back in his rightful place. Yeah, so it's interesting, and you wonder, I suppose, you're a museum director, you know how these things work, that you have to talk to a committee about moving somebody. It's not an easy thing to move a statue, and people become accustomed to seeing what they see, and they don't like it when there's a new statue there.
What are your thoughts on the continued use of the term Darwinism? We don't speak of Newtonianism or Einsteinism. Do you think that the term Darwinism may work counter to wider acceptance of evolutionary theory?
Thank you. You've put your finger on a really important point, because opposition to evolutionary theory will frequently phrase it in terms of Darwin and Darwinism, and have images of Darwin which have horns on and things like that. So that's an easy target. Whereas biologists, as you know, are not wedded to the theories that were put forward in 1859. Biology has moved and transformed in such a way that it's much more reasonable to call it evolutionary biology, and most evolutionary biologists call it evolutionary biology. They don't call it Darwinism. It's me that calls it Darwinism, because what I was trying to do was to map a particular body of thought through the ages, and it gets Darwinism as a label gets dropped the 1950s, probably 1960s, really, perhaps. I've never actually researched that, but now that we all have Google, there's an easy way of doing that, which is called an n-gram, and you can type in the word you're searching for, and it goes through Google Books, looking for the word you've typed in, and you can see how that word rises and falls in the titles of books. So I can do that. Thank you. But most evolutionary biologists would either call themselves integrative biologists now, or they'd be population biologists, or they would be something else, but they wouldn't be Darwinists unless they were celebrating Darwin Day, or they were doing something particularly related to natural selection, let's say.
Yes, I was not in town last Tuesday, so I missed your first lecture. And what I was wondering is, what did Darwin initially have in mind when he set out on that voyage?
Oh. He wanted to collect. He was absolutely sure that he had been chosen because of his ability to collect very widely specimens. And he had taken a couple of catch-up lessons with his professors in order to do that. But when he set out, he saw himself mostly as a geologist and took geological books with him. He understood his role was to be a gentleman naturalist, that the ship would take him to different places and that his task was to examine the natural products of the place. So his own sense of what he was doing was collecting for Great Britain. He was a private individual. His father paid for him to go on that trip. He was on the Royal Navy for food and transport, and the Admiralty made a lot of useful concessions to Darwin so that he seems to be an official naturalist, but he was an unofficial naturalist. And he imagined that what he would do when he first set out was that he thought it was going to be 2 years, that he would come back and he would then join the church as his family had expected, and he too expected at that point. And on that voyage, which was 5 years eventually, he completely transformed into a naturalist, someone who wanted to live independently and write and study. So when he came back, the idea of joining the church had completely gone out of his mind. So there's a whole it's 5 years, and he was only 22. So there's lots of changes to how he imagined the voyage when he set out to what he actually achieved by the time he got back.
And did he ever give his reasons for not following up on his initial intention to be part of the church?
He reflected on it in his autobiography, and he even makes a little joke about it. It's very strange that he should have been intended for the church. And he said that through the voyage, his faith gradually declined. There were possibly talks with the captain about such things. He was engaged in reading very deeply a book by Charles Lyell on the physical geology of the Earth that explained the whole of the geology of the Earth with no reference to a creator. He was reading other books of similar kinds. So his sense of the explanations for the natural world shifted from being divine intervention to completely natural under the guidance of Lyell's book. And he encountered some rather dramatic natural events like an earthquake and a volcano erupting. He never turned to a religious explanation for those, not during the voyage. He'd lost all that.
Okay. Thank you.
Like the other gentleman, I apologize if you've covered these and I was unaware of it, but I have two, I hope, quick ones. Was Darwin at all familiar with, or were any of his main followers familiar with the work of other naturalists, say, like Thoreau and Audubon, that were a little bit before him? And secondly, did the somewhat hijacked Darwin, I don't know if you'd call it an antecedent, but the use of the term social Darwinism by economists and political theorists, which sometimes got further hijacked by the conservative wing of those groups to say, because I'm a millionaire, I've evolved, and that proves that I'm the best.
Yes, there's two very different questions. So, gosh, you're going to have to remind me the first one. About Audubon and Thoreau. So, no, he didn't read them. His reading was confined mostly to the European tradition, and when he was reading books about nature, he tended to go for Wordsworth's poems, for example, rather than Thoreau. Thoreau's a little later. We know Thoreau read Darwin, but we also know that Darwin didn't read Thoreau, so I'm sorry about that. He must surely have looked at Audubon, but where would he get access to an Audubon copy? There's one in the Linnaean Society in London. It's a big book, as you know. it's not clear that Darwin needed the information from an Audubon plate for any of the kinds of things he was trying to say. And the social Darwinism, thank you, because that is something that we should be thinking about. You know, it's a phrase that was invented to describe the application of competition and survival to humans. It's Herbert Spencer who particularly brings the expression survival of the fittest into play, although Darwin adopts it from Spencer, so later editions of Darwin's books have that phrase in it. And although I haven't talked about it at all, there's plenty of scholarly work that explores the other evolutionary thinkers in the 19th century, including Spencer, who had written about these kinds of things, competition and progress, before Darwin published. And so after Darwin, the views of a number of people get into the same kind of nexus of evolutionary thought in which competition, survival, progress, which wasn't part of Darwin's scheme, and cutthroat, competitive business practices become part of the same kind of complex. Social Darwinism really shouldn't be called social Darwinism, it should be called social evolutionism, but then we lose some of its bite, and I know people like to think that it is Darwin who brings that about. Yeah.
So Bill, there was a
one more?
question.
Is Bill? Oh, one more.
There was a question there. If you want to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to follow up on the diagram that you showed toward the end of the talk on belief or not in evolution in various countries. And I noticed that most of those countries were from Europe, a few from the Middle East. And I just wondered if you had a sense of what that graph would look like if it did include more parts of the world at this time.
Yes, thank you. That's a very perceptive question. There's no Japan in there. There's very few Middle Eastern countries. There's no Southern India. Did you see Japan? Was it in there? I'm sorry.
India's
Okay, no Korea.
India.
And India was there. So I think if it was a genuinely global survey now, 10 years later, it would be very interesting. And it perhaps wouldn't have that nice little curve to it. But you probably noticed that the ones up at the top of the chart were mostly Scandinavian. Yes. And the people who put that chart together used it particularly to advocate for better science education. And you know, I've thought about that. I'm not sure that more science education would change the culture of the countries in which these points of view are being expressed. If the American pole had just done the Northeast Corridor, it would be completely different. So there's a size, a geographical spread issue as well. So we all know poles don't really tell us much except what we want poles to tell us. But isn't that an effective one? Yeah, it's very striking. Thank you.
So Bill, you can have a final question.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for a wonderful series of lectures. The story of Lyell's book going along with Darwin was, you read that everywhere. But another great set of books that were being published at the time was Humboldt. And Humboldt's voyages in life seems to parallel Darwin so much. Did he have any sense of connection with Humboldt?
Yes, he did. Thank you for asking that question. So Darwin, as a very young man at university, read Humboldt's personal narrative of his voyage in the equinoctial regions and was enchanted both by the sort of daring-do, the adventuring nature of what Humboldt describes, the climbing of the mountains, the measurement, the scientific results that Humboldt brought, but also the ability to express in words an appreciation of nature and the sublimity that Humboldt writes about. And Darwin wished so hard to emulate Humboldt in his own journal, the Naturalist Voyage, we call it Voyage of the Beagle now, his own journal of researches, which was published 40 years after Humboldt. And Darwin was like a young boy when he had an opportunity to meet Humboldt late in Humboldt's life. Humboldt visited London and Darwin went to see him, to have breakfast with him. And they corresponded a tiny bit as well. So that, yes, Humboldt's a really important part of Darwin's early impressionable years. And there are scholars who we both know, our friends, who suggest it's more than just being an impressionable moment, is that Darwin somehow picks up the romantic tradition that Humboldt represented and translates it into a more secular kind of vision of the natural world that keeps the sublime. Yes, thank you. So it was a wonderful question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.